Wizards are one of the oldest standing fantasy archetypes. While the modern image of a wizard presumably comes from Gandalf and Lord of the Rings, as 90% of things fantasy do, the idea of magic goes back basically as far as human history. I'm sure Grug and Ugg in their caves were discussing the legendary mage Grug-Ugg, who could lift even the mightiest of boulders with their mind powers. And at least in modern times, a common thing with wizards is that they tend to be squishy. Even if it's just for gameplay purposes, because letting the wizard out-melee the fighter and barbarian would have them fall behind even more, wizards tend to fall apart the moment someone gets within stabbing range. Most things to mitigate this don't really fix the issue, they just put a band-aid on it. Like the spell Shield in D&D doesn't magically make your wizard a god up close, it just makes them harder to hit. But what if, instead of getting wizards by having someone innately talented in magic hone their skills, or by having someone pore through old tomes, we pump them full of super soldier juice and give them the genes of the guy crafted by God to be the perfect wizard? This line of questioning is how we got the Thousand Sons Legion of Space Marines. Unfortunately, the Emperor did not think to ask himself what the consequences of telling his son and his son's sons, who really like to use magic, not to use magic, which is how we got the Thousand Sons Legion of Chaos Space Marines. In the 41st millennium, the Thousand Sons are mages unmatched and super soldiers to boot, those that aren't afraid of vacuums at any rate. So if you like wizards but wish they could also plant their foot through a tank, then come see if the Thousand Sons might be the army for you. But before I start talking about fictional magic, would you like to know where you can get some magical headphones? Because this message is sponsored by Raycon. There's nothing like starting the new year off right, so how about you make sure your audio starts off right too with Raycon's bone conduction headphones? Because they send vibrations straight to your bones, you're getting crystal clear audio. But at the same time, this means you can still hear the world around you just fine. Going for a walk? No need to worry about not hearing someone passing you by, you can still hear everything. With a 13-hour battery life, they'll keep you company through the whole day, and since they're waterproof and dustproof, it doesn't matter if you get caught out in the rain or you're sweating hard at the gym for a New Year's resolution. These bad boys will stay strong throughout. Oh, and they're half the price of competing brands, just in case you needed the extra incentive. I still use them around the house, but also while I'm taking my dog out on a walk. She gets some exercise, I don't have to worry about missing something while we're out, and of course, I get nice high-quality audio. It's the perfect time to upgrade your audio for the new year. Go to buyraycon.com/pancreasnoworkbc to get 20% off site-wide. Thanks to Raycon for sponsoring. Now then, let's see the history and fallout of what happens when Magnus does nothing wrong. I think I've said this near exact line like 3 times now, but it keeps being apt. The Thousand Sons as Space Marines share the same origin as all other Space Marines. Created by Jimmy God Emperor Space as a replacement for his first batch of super soldiers, the Thunder Warriors, the Thousand Sons were one of the 20 legions intended to conquer the galaxy. Born from the gene seed of Magnus the Red, this naturally made them exceptionally powerful psychers. Just about every Thousand Son had some level of psychic ability, and their real powerful psychers were the kinds that could crush groups of tanks like soda cans. Of course, this awesome sounding setup comes with plenty of costs. For one, there was apparently a brief resurgence of warp storms around Terra and the Sol system as Thousand Son gene seed was being developed. It supposedly didn't do too much to the gene seed, but that's the kind of omen that really makes you wonder what's coming later down the line. While their naming initially seems to have come from the fact Big E set them out once their numbers hit 1,000 exactly, their early history reads like the opening cutscene of Halo Wars. Setback after setback, loss after loss, because their gene seed was cursed. Their true psychic potential only awakened a few years into the Great Crusade. Prior to this, they weren't really a standout legion. Competent, sure, but so were all Space Marines. Alongside this magical power, however, also came the flesh change. Thousand Son Marines would devolve into horrific masses of flesh and agony, basically chaos spawn, and sometimes this would just happen out of nowhere. Steve would be making a cup of coffee and suddenly turn into the Thing, just like that. While their powers would increase more and more, so too did the rate of the flesh change. The Emperor and Malkador would put some of them into stasis to try and cure it, but the result they came to was that it was impossible, and their final efforts just boiled down to hoping reuniting the Legion with Magnus would fix things. It should be taken note of that early on, the reaction towards the Legion of Wizards was a bit more mixed than you might think, given what we know of 40K. Plenty of Imperials and rediscovered Primarchs certainly weren't fans of the Legion of Wizards, Mortarion of course being one of the biggest haters, but at the same time a good chunk of people appreciated having them around. While chaos wasn't too much of a thing during the Great Crusade, publicly anyways, there were plenty of psychic Xenos hanging around. Having an army of wizards on standby for when anything like that showed up was appreciated, because power word Scrunch is a hell of a spell to be able to throw it on command. I've also no hard evidence for this, but I would speculate that the Thousand Sons early on were a lot more defensive with their power powers because they didn't become turbo wizards until later on. Psychic Xenos appear, they throw up defensive spells, and then shoot the alien mage in the face. That's a lot easier for the common man to appreciate than offensive powers, which are a lot scarier. The Flesh Change only got worse and worse though, with her powers also increasing alongside it. By the time Prospero was discovered and Magnus brought him to the fold, there was once again only 1,000 of them left. Magnus naturally threw himself into trying to cure the Flesh Change as well, only to meet the same dead ends as the Emperor did. Desperate, he eventually made a deal with a small, barely worth mentioning warp entity known as Tzeentch. Oops. In as much fairness to Magnus as possible, he was out of options and wanted to save his legion. Certainly he was being arrogant, and while he likely knew Tzeentch was a powerful warp entity, he also likely didn't know he was, Tzeentch, the chaos god of magic. He was essentially just able to throw any more shit at the wall, and this seemed like the only remaining route to him. Of course, arrogance still guided him, no doubt, but in the end a deal was struck, and in exchange for one of his eyes, the 1,000 Suns were seemingly cured of the Flesh Change. A pretty small price to pay. Between that and a new stable source of gene seed, courtesy of Magnus coming in a test tube, or however they got gene seed out of Primarchs, then the 1,000 Suns could once again have more than just 1,000 dudes, although the name goes hard, so they kept it anyways. Magnus reorganized the Legion to be more wizardy, since even with their powers, they were functionally organized as a standard Legion might be, and they doubled down on all the mystical stuff. Libraries were pilfered and their contents poured over, planets oftentimes spared from destruction not out of kindness or anything like that, but because the T-Suns didn't want to ruin all the potential lore they could find. This would outright interrupt military campaigns, with on one occasion Magnus attempting to plead to Conrad Kurz of all people to cease an orbital bombardment because it would blow up a library he really wanted to look through. In case you were wondering if the Primarch known for hanging people by their skin from lampposts listened to Magnus, no, he did not. Sometimes they just leave a military campaign if they heard there was a source of knowledge nearby, which combined with their increased use of psychic powers meant their reputation started going down the gutter. And they were so unbelievably arrogant too. That's hardly new to Warhammer. Everyone but the Tyranids are arrogant, and that's only because the hive mind probably doesn't have the concept of arrogance in it. But the 1,000 Suns, in addition to the standard I am Prince Vegeta style of arrogance where they think they're so much better and will happily tell you, were the worst kind of arrogant on top of it. Patronizingly arrogant. Oh, you silly little person, of course you don't understand why the warp is such a wonderful and beautiful thing. You're just a normal person, but maybe with our guidance you could one day appreciate and know a fraction of what we do. At least the Eldar just call you lesser to your face and not that crap. All of this turned the opinion of the T-Suns into those cool wizard master chiefs you can call upon into a bunch of smug pricks delving too deep into the warp that may damn well leave you high and dry and then call you stupid for not understanding why they abandoned you in the face of an orc horde. Eventually the Council of Nicaea was called, named after the Council of Nicaea, where the nature of Jesus Christ and his relationship to God was debated because yeah, Biggie, that's a smart way to convince people to be atheist. The end result boils down to the Emperor going, no more wizards because you morons can't control yourself, of which some people followed and some people followed in public. The interesting thing is, this event actually makes me think a bit of a Warhammer fantasy piece of lore. The College of Azir magic, the Wind of the Heavens, has a funny little trial its aspirants go through. One of their earliest tasks is to clean the windows on their astronomy domes. Naturally, the first thought of everyone is, I'm going to do it with magic. The senior wizards, however, in addition to being familiar with such magic, also went through those same trials, so if they see an aspirant doing that, they'll be punished and told to start over. The trick here isn't to not use magic, it's to learn how to subtly control your magic, weaving the heavens with control and finesse rather than brute forcing it, so it looks like you cleaned it normally, even though you used magic. While this has never been confirmed and likely never will be, a generous interpretation of the Council of Nicaea could be that the Emperor was trying to do the same thing. If Magnus and his sons could use warpcraft subtly, rather than using it to transform to Titan size and cosplay as a kaiju, then he'd be perfectly fine with them using the warp. If that was the intention, then Magnus and his sons completely failed at it. While the Legion at large initially followed Big E's edicts, Magnus just kept on being himself, which naturally trickled down to his Legion after a bit, digging themselves deeper and deeper into the hole they soon wouldn't be able to climb out of. Come the Horus Heresy, however, and for all their arrogance, they were still loyal. Magnus, in fact, wanted to warn the Emperor that Horus had turned, because arrogant though he was, this arrogance was out of a genuine belief he and his Legion were right in how the world worked. His way of warning the Emperor was, unfortunately, to burst through the magical walls around his super-secret main project like the Kool-Aid Man, however, flooding the Webway Neotera with demons and ruining Daddy Dearest's plans. The Emperor was naturally displeased and told Leman Russ to go drag Magnus's bright red ass to Terra for one hell of a chewing out. Horus would then convince Leman Russ to actually just kill him, so Magnus could be taken off the board completely, and then the burning of Prospero happens. Magnus decides he needs to atone, as does his entire legion, so he gives the Space Wolves free reign to slaughter everyone on his homeworld. A couple of Thousand Sun ships were sent elsewhere, but mostly the orbital defenses were dispersed, the planetary shields that supposedly rivaled those of Terra turned off, and the entire planet cut off from the outside world. The Thousand Suns did not do well at first, as even though they resisted Magnus's orders to let the Space Wolves kill them all, they were horribly unprepared for the Emperor's personal legion of executioners. Also, the flesh change popped up again, because Tzeentch didn't make it go away so much as he put it on a timer. Even when Magnus once again flipped and decided to join the fight, it was too little too late, and it was only at the last moment did escape occur. Tzeentch was whispering to Magnus the whole time, and in a desperate move to save what could be saved, Magnus accepted the Changer of Ways deal to get everyone left out of the Space Wolves, Custodians, and Sisters of Silence path. Tzeentch did just that. Hooray! Then Magnus started falling apart at the seams down to his very soul. Not hooray. Then the flesh change came back even worse. Womp womp. You know what I find really neat about this, though? You can find a lot of older codices online as PDFs, including the 4th edition Chaos Space Marine Codex, and the story of Prospero burning there is almost completely different. The Space Wolves still burn Prospero to the ground, but here Magnus doesn't decide the rest of the planet is committing suicide alongside him, willingly or not. The Space Wolves just showed up and attacked so rapidly the Thousand Suns didn't have a chance. They didn't even use much sorcery to escape, they just broke the blockade with as many ships as they could. Hell, they only joined up with Horus because they wanted shelter from future attacks, and the Emperor had marked them for death for messing with the warp. It's nice and reasonable, isn't it? Everything in that version makes sense, as opposed to Magnus the Red and his revolving door of motivations and decision-making. Isaac Ahriman, meanwhile, cunning little guy that he was, decided he would succeed where Magnus had failed. He would finally stop the flesh change himself, as he was there from the beginning, where it took countless brothers away from him, including his literal, actual twin brother, who was also a T-Son. Stealing Magnus's big book of magic and casting the Rubric of Ahriman, he proved that like father, like son is a saying that still holds strong in the 41st millennium. For exceptionally psychically powerful Thousand Suns, this worked out perfectly. The flesh change was halted, all is well. For every other Thousand Sun, they turned to dust in their armor. Ahriman initially considered it a bit of an unfortunate thing that happened, but overall was more than happy with the results. Then over time he considered what exactly he had done, and has since that realization almost rabidly looked for a way to undo it. Ahriman would eventually try a second rubric, which largely failed as the rituals redirected to stabilize Magnus's mind and the largest bits of his soul that was the demon Primarch Magnus the Red. It did undo it for 1,000 Sun named Helio Isidorus, but there was some weird chaos shit going on with him, and he couldn't remember anything but his name. Ahriman eventually went back in time to destroy Helio's soul at the casting of the second rubric, so all that nonsense that occurred with Helio didn't actually happen. Ahriman learned a lesson about not being able to change the past, the Thousand Suns were prevented from becoming all Rubric Marines, or whatever the hell the Pyro Doman was doing, and a funny little time travel story happened. The time travel was done with a Necron artifact, by the way, because naturally such a thing wouldn't be used by the Necrons themselves, although I guess Orican and his own time-traveling shenanigans do more than make up for that. Come the 41st millennium, and the Thousand Suns have had a very varied success rate, let's call it. Frequently they can be found leading their own miniature warbands across the galaxy, as the remaining sorcerers who weren't rubricked either took some existing ones or figured out how to make new ones and struck out on their own. Frequently they would also sell their services out to the highest bidder amongst other chaos forces, since plenty of people are willing to give you a few human sacrifices in exchange for having the super wizard on their side. And as with all chaos forces, you could find them occasionally banding together to bring ruin to the Imperium en masse. See the various Black Crusades for instances of that. That's not to say they lack their own agency. That's maybe a bad way to put it, since Tzeentch is eternally tugging on their strings even if they don't admit it, but they do their own things as well. Ahriman's novels have him venturing across time and space, as I mentioned before, and Magnus the Red likes to attack the Space Wolves every now and again as vengeance for Prospero. You can tell that lore was written before the Horus Heresy retconned the specifics of Prospero, because Magnus is seeking vengeance, because if it was written with modern lore in mind, that would make no sense, because Prospero burning was his fault. Then again, he's also a demon Primarch, so no small amount of insanity and bias is to be expected, and it's been 10,000 years, so maybe he just forgot what happened exactly. His greatest achievement in this was bringing forth the new homeworld of the Thousand Suns, the planet of the sorcerer Satarius, into real space. This was done by some ritual Tzeentch nonsense on Fenris of all places. Eventually Magnus decided that empire building sounded like a good time, and Tzeentch was a bit jealous of Nurgle having the Scourge Stars as his own real space realm, so Magnus and the Thousand Sons set up the new kingdom in the Stygian sector of space. It's honestly not the worst place to be if you're a psyker. Magnus likes those folks still. If you're a normal person, then I hope you don't mind either becoming fuel for a psyker ritual or turning into a Zangor, though. As the 42nd millennium dawns, the Thousand Sons alongside the rest of the traitor legions are marching in greater numbers. Rubrics march forth, tearing into the enemies of their sorceress masters, who cast spells and rituals that tear into the fabric of reality and drive their foes to insanity or worse. They've been out of the spotlight for a bit, but that doesn't mean they've gone anywhere, and really, who's to say them lying low for a bit isn't just one of Tzeentch's infinite schemes? The time to start investing in Tzeentch coin is now, because it's the only shitcoin that can be rug pulled and shoot to the moon at the same time. So let's see what the Thousand Sons have going for them, shall we? Easy stuff first, of course. The first is that the Thousand Sons are wizards. Wizards, or psychers, are always going to have prominence in 40k. It's a science fantasy setting, and the fantasy part of science fantasy is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. As the servants of the god of fate and magic, there's a level of both mysticism and respect the Thousand Sons always will have no matter what. Some Thousand fans will probably kill me for that sentence, but I don't necessarily mean the Thousand Sons always win battles they probably should, or do the incredibly obvious and logical thing. No, what I mean is that the Thousand Sons appearing is always at least treated verbally with some amount of respect. They wield uncanny powers only enhanced by who they worship or are enslaved to. Their mere presence drives men mad in a way the other factions can't hope to do. And aside from any power all this might give them, it means it's always an event when they show up. Everyone stands to attention when they arrive, because even if the sorcerer in charge of an operation is a complete fool, magic being what it is in this setting means you have to take him seriously. If John Smith, the Thousand Son sorcerer, botches all his casting rolls and explodes, you still need to deal with the inevitable side effects of him exploding. So in many ways, the Thousand Sons have a level of fear and respect given to them that most can't match. Also, wizards. Wizards are cool, I've said it before and I'll keep saying it. Cast the Twist of Fate and spin your opponent's reproductive system around like a dreidel. The magical powers flowing underneath reality are yours to command, with the express backing of the god of magic and fate to go wild with them. With that being said, these are wizard space marines. With that single sentence, you avoid the trappings of wizards normally being squishy meatbags, which will naturally show back up in the tabletop rows. If you see someone in a story close in with the Thousand Sons in melee, that isn't a winning move by default. They are genetically augmented super soldiers created by a god to bring ruin to the enemies of man, and in their first deployments they weren't even wizards yet. They can very easily punch your teeth through the back of your head, which is a ton of fun. Plus, since they're space marines, they get that inherent level of respect too, in addition to the first point I made. Yeah, the Horus Heresy makes them look pretty goofy at times, but they get to be in the Horus Heresy in plenty of starring roles. Whether you find the lore amazing or appalling, you have plenty of lore to be found if you want it. That doesn't make it good lore, of course, but you aren't starving, unlike the League of Votann or old world-shaped elephants in the room. Beyond those obvious things, though, the Thousand Sons are another army that's great at most scales of engagement. Massive battles where Magnus is leading his cursed children against entire crusade fleets is pretty fun. He does that fairly regularly now, actually, including on the moon itself. Like the moon over Terra, where he gave a damn good attempt at killing Guilliman on the doorstep of Terra itself and was only stopped because he was facing the combined might of the Custodes, Sisters of Silence, Eldar, and the Ultramarines. If that's what it takes to put Magnus down, then anyone else is royally screwed when the Thousand Sons march to war. But on the other hand, everyone loves a singular evil wizard scheming and plotting at his tower before enacting some grand plan. Look me in the eyes and tell me that you can't see a Thousand Son going off on his own and telling some planetary governor that if they won't kneel before a sultan, then they'll cower before a sorcerer. The Thousand Sons can easily also just be one guy casting spells willy-nilly because he's either a pawn in a greater scheme, a true mastermind finally unveiling his plot in full power, or just off his rocker on chaos juice and going on a blender. As long as it's ambitious, it fits the army. They're also for you if you like a bit of tragedy to go with your fall to chaos, though as I make more of these videos, I find that you can admittedly say that about most Chaos Space Marines depending on how you frame them. The Thousand Sons, though, unlike the World Eaters, were genuinely interested in uplifting humanity. They genuinely thought they were doing good work, that they were justified in their actions, from their sorcerous powers to how ravenously they pursued knowledge. They took in psychers and taught them, and even if it was in part for selfish reasons, worlds conquered by them tended to be largely left in one piece. Or at least big enough pieces you could fit them back together again, which is a lot more that can be said of several of the traitor legions, or even the loyal loyalists before even the Horus Heresy began. And you can read Magnus's fall generously, even if the specifics are a bit goofy in modern times. The old 4th edition one makes it truly tragic to me. The Emperor, whether right or not, decided that no one could harness the warp without falling to chaos, and so we had the Space Wolves blitzkrieg their home. Magnus was given no choice, no options, just had ships rain hellfire down on his home, and he fled to the only person that would take him, Horus, the arch-traitor. Even nowadays, you can find tragedy. He tried to warn the Emperor about Horus, even if it turned out to be in the most damaging way possible. He tried to atone for his sins in death, even though he recanted that idea. He fragmented, with his mind utterly shattering and what was eventually reforged literally lacking the noble part of his soul that made him a decent person. And when Magnus' sons, Aramin in particular, tried to fix their curse, they only made things worse. Ever since, they've spent their lives, or unlives, toyed with by the changer of ways for plots they can't even comprehend. The history of the Thousand Sons is tragedy after tragedy, very compelling stuff, because in all readings, they tried to drag mankind to the light only to be kicked down into the dark. Not that they need to be tragic, of course. Mustache-twirling wizards are an equally fun kind of villain to the tragic one. With a wave of their wrist and a flick of their wand, the entirety of Ultramar's supply of grain has been turned into arsenic, cue evil laughter, only to be foiled by those darn smurfs and their meddling Cato Sicarius or what have you. If you've had your souls forcibly sold to the devil, you may as well have fun with it, so have a wicked laugh and blast Glory Hammer while you ride forth in the name of the evil god of magic. Have fun with your villainy, goddammit. I'll even go so far as to say I don't want more tragic reasons a Chaos Marine is the way he is. I want the dude laughing as he turns people into frogs. Now tell me, do you like robots? I like robots. What if I told you the Thousand Sons have robots? In fact, they have 2 kinds of robots, which I honestly forgot about the second one. The more technical robot are the Rubric Marines themselves that make up the majority of their numbers, though they're honestly something like zombie robots. And yes, I know, the Necrons already exist, but these are wizard zombie robots. Rubric Marines were turned into dust sealed inside their armor, and they have only the barest of hints of what they once were within them. While technically sapient, the best case scenario for a Rubric Marine is to be enslaved to a sorcerer and aware of it, eternally bound to their whims as these former scholars are reduced to nothing but glorified guard duty and attack dogs. More tragedy, but you get wizard zombie robots out of the deal, so I'd say it's worth their pain. There's also the Sekitar robots, which are magitech robots charmed to look just like statues until they come to life and start shooting. I presume there's also some glamour around them that makes people register them as harmless statues, because otherwise that trick would only ever really work once. And last lore positive, the Thousand Sons are a great army for those of you who want your Chaos army to be a bit more constructive than they usually tend to be. The New Kingdom proves this. For as much as Tzeentch is still chaos and happily end-time settings left and right, he likes building stuff too. What's the point of a scheme if not to work towards something after all? Magnus and his ilk have set up a kingdom in real space that is a functional entity as a government. Yeah, one that's just another puppet of Tzeentch, but it still works. Just because the taxes are paid in human souls doesn't mean someone isn't collecting taxes. It even attracts psychers from across the galaxy to join it, and while this is of course a Tzeentchian plot for power, it also is in many ways setting itself up as a refuge for psychers. With the way the Imperium views them, Burn the Witch and all that, they really don't have to try very hard to get people to sign up. It's not like Tzeentch couldn't figure out how to lie about what'll happen when they get there, if nothing else. The Thousand Sons even have their own version of the Imperial Guard, the Spire Guard. Once the PDF of Prospero, now they're mortal soldiers trained and instructed by the Thousand Sons to fight for them. They're a disciplined and well-equipped army, quite frequently better off than the Imperial Guard, and augmented by the sorcery of their Space Marine overlords. They're of course perfectly expendable. Magnus doesn't give a shit if the meat shields die as long as the wizardry goes well. But they're proof that the Thousand Sons, even in the thrall of chaos, can still build something, that they can work towards a goal and be constructive rather than just tearing down the Imperium and chaos. So if you want to do a bit of empire building with your tabletop army, but still want to swear fealty to the Dark Gods, the Thousand Sons are easily your best bet. Let's start off with some nice and simple army rules. Fun fact, the Thousand Sons are the only army that still has access to the Psychic phase, even if only kind of. While I'm in eternal Eldar agony over this, as a potential Thousand Sons player, you still get to have fun. At the start of your shooting phase, any model with the Psyker keyword can attempt to cast a ritual. You've got a few to choose from, that you can only cast each ritual once per shooting phase. While it's also true that a given Psyker can only try to cast a single ritual, you're playing the Thousand Sons. If you're running short on Psykers, you've either taken some grievous casualties, or you've built your army list wrong. You roll 2d6 to see if the ritual goes off, and you can channel the warp for another d6 as well. If you roll equal or greater to the number requirement of the ritual, it goes off, though keep in mind that if you roll any doubles on the d6, the caster takes d3 mortal wounds. The spell can go off even if this happens, but the caster might not live to see it. Such is the risk when you play Tzeentch, however, so throw caution to the wind and channel the warp all you want. The rituals are as follows. Destiny's Ruin goes off on a 5 and lets anyone attacking a given enemy unit reroll 1s to hit against them. If you reroll 10 or higher on the casting roll, it's rerolling all hits. Temporal Surge goes off on a 6 and lets a unit move d6 inches, and if you roll a 10 or higher, it's a guaranteed 6 inches. They can't charge afterwards either way, but it can be a great way to get a ranged model into proper position. Twist of Fate goes off on a 9 and lets units attacking the targeted enemy unit get 1 to their AP value, or 2 if you rolled a 12. And Doombolt is Mind Bullets. Goes off on a 7, the targeted enemy unit suffers d3 mortal wounds, and if you roll an 11 or higher, they suffer d3 plus 3 mortal wounds instead. Solid stuff all around, especially when used properly, although using Doombolt properly really just involves using it. Yeah, you could pick targets smartly with it, or you can look at the first model you see and cast Brain Explosion. Let's look at the attachments now. Grand Coven's rules makes weapons with the psychic keyword stronger through various buffs. A chosen buff lasts until your next command phase, but you can only use each buff once, so be smart with it. Add 6 inches to the range, add 1 to the wound rolls, and giving them devastating wounds are the options available to you. The stratagems, meanwhile, and what I fear may be a running theme, do a whole lot of stuff. To be fair, this is the Tzeentch army, so if there's any faction where your stratagems are random, unrelated crap, it by all means should be the Thousand Suns. You can get sticky objectives, give one of your units one of those psychic weapon buffs even if they already used it or another is in play. Reroll the dice you use for your army roll. Throw shit at the wall and see what sticks, and if that's a problem for you, then take your sensitive ass back to the World Eaters. This is the Thousand Suns, bitch. We do nonsense in this motherfucker. Change Host of Deceit, meanwhile, is the demon one. You want to play demons because GW hates the demons being together since it's unprofitable or something? Here you go. The detachment rule gives Thousand Suns units a 4-up invuln save if they're close to demons, and lets demons use the army rule for more Doombolt options. The stratagems are naturally for doing wacky things like putting demons into strategic reserve, forcing an enemy unit to target demons instead of a proper Thousand Suns unit, or outright preventing a unit from shooting at demons if they're far away enough. There's not too much in the way of properly buffing units with this detachment, but to be fair, giving your Thousand Suns a 4-up invuln for free as long as you use proper positioning goes a long way without stratagem support. Warp Meld Pact is the detachment designed to make me angry. You see, this is the dedicated chaff detachment, buffing the weaker units in the army that aren't the Marines. Good stuff in theory, and with how it speaks of buffing Tzeentch mutants, that gives me high hopes. Tzeentch is the chaos god that makes the real interesting mutants, things that hurt your brain if you even try to look at and figure them out. But do you know what almost everything with the Tzeentch mutant keyword is? A Zangor. Thousand Suns players will never be free. The actual detachment rules that you reduce wound rolls against attacks targeting your Zangors. Those Zangors are so shit that if you do so, they take d3 mortal wounds afterwards. So there's potential for it to not work because your enemy rolled nothing but 6s on their wound rolls, and then whoever is left dies from the d3 mortals. You can also do the same for your own Zangor's wound roll against enemy units, which can also not work in the same way, because you rolled all 1s and then 8 d3 mortals anyways. The stratagems are of course all for buffing mutants, which mostly means Zangors, with one exception that's for replacing a Thousand Suns character unit with a Chaos spawn. There's even a stratagem for returning d3 plus 1 Zangors to a unit after you eat shit on your detachment rule and 3 of them die. Isn't that fun? Can you tell I'm not much a fan of Zangors? Why are the Beastmen prominent in a Space Marine army? Stupid dumb bird goats. Rubric Phalanx has a nice and easy detachment rule. If an attack hits a Rubric unit that only has damage 1, you get to add 1 to their armor saving throw. In the off instance I don't think actually exists of a damage 1 attack having AP 4 or something, then yeah, you're SOL, but for the most part this is a huge durability boost. Bolters, lasguns, shuriken catapults. If you've got a lot of Rubrics, this detachment rule makes those weapons damn near useless against them. The stratagems are much the same, in the same way making Rubric units better off. Let them fall back while still being able to shoot and charge. Give their weapons assault so they can run and gun. Give their guns strength 5 and the psychic keyword. You get yourself some real handy abilities with this detachment, and Rubrics will usually be the heart of the army in at least some way, so this is a good one. Warp-Forged Cabal is the vehicle one meanwhile. If your vehicles are near a Thousand Suns Psyker, you can reroll 1 hit, wound, and damage roll of theirs. Otherwise, you can reroll any one of those rolls you make a turn. Also, if they're nearby a friendly Psyker, they can also activate Deadly Demise on a roll of a 5 instead of a 6. That can make them more damaging, but it'll also naturally damage the Psyker, so heads up. Naturally, the stratagems all have to do with making sure you get what you paid for out of a vehicle. Now, it should be noted that while this may sound lame, keep in mind that everything from the Sekitar robots to Mauler Fiends to Helldrakes count as vehicles. This is a lot more versatile with what can be boosted than just buffing a Rhino and hoping that gets you anywhere. And Hexwarp Thrallband is all about more magic stuff. You get Zones of Magic. Your deployment zone always counts as one, and no man's land in your enemy's deployment zone can be counted as part of your Zone of Magic as long as you control at least half of the objective markers within them. Anytime a unit of yours makes a psychic attack, you can reroll wound rolls of 1, and if they make one within your Zone of Magic, you can instead add 1 to the wound roll. Their stratagems, of course, all revolve around the same concept. They do a variety of things, and some are handily either way, but as a rule of thumb, they're all at least much better if they're used in a way that interacts with your Zone of Magic. One of them, the sticky objectives, doesn't even work if it isn't targeting a unit within a Zone of Magic. It's a variety of things much like the first one, but now you need some more positioning to make it work at full capacity. Perfect for the Tzeentchian who's more into the planning than the random crap method of dealing with problems. Alright, the actual army now. And I'm not going to start with the Marines because I want to get my broccoli out of the way first, as well as answer an important question. Why would you take Tzaangors in your army? Well, for one, you can put them into strategic reserves at the end of your opponent's turn as long as they're farther than 6 inches from the enemy, so you can be tricky with them. Combine that with them having the Scouts rule, and they can pull off some movement shenanigans like few others. They're also just cheap at 70 points for 10 or 160 points for a unit of 20. Toughness 4 is solid enough for chaff, though their weapons aren't anything to write home about, and their saves are garbage, even if an invuln save is neat to see on the meat shields. With rerolls to advancing and charging, as long as the dude with the horn lives, and adding 1 to leadership if the dude with the banner lives, they can do solid stuff if you want them. And when they're led by a Tzaangor shaman, they can do better, it should be said, gaining a +1 to their hit rolls, which is otherwise always at a 4 up to hit. The shaman ranged attack is actually pretty sick, and he can sacrifice a Tzaangor he's leading to add D3 attacks and strength to the hit. If you roll well, you can temporarily allow your Tzaangor shaman to be wounding characters like Kain or Angron on a 3-up, which is kind of ridiculous. They can also lead Tzaangor and Lighten, though those units are far pricier per model, so maybe don't just feed Tzaangors into the Shaman's Spirit Bomb unless you're willing to risk a decent chunk of points relative to what you might end up getting. Normal Tzaangor Enlightened are still fairly cheap and can auto-wound on the charge, and their melee weapons have precision which, if you don't mind using them as a sacrificial lamb, can potentially allow them to rush in and butcher an important character to deny your opponent using them in a unit. The Enlightened with great bows are much the same, but with a 30-inch ranged weapon that does alright damage and wounds all around, if only at strength 5. The great bows aren't much pricier, so while someone min-maxing might have to make tough choices, if you're just throwing together an army and want some goat birds, the choice is really if you want ranged or melee attacks. In either case, they have 10 inches of movement and both their saves are 5-up instead of 6-up, as well as having 2 wounds instead of 1 like normal Tzaangors. Definitely more durable, and with precision they can potentially ruin your enemy's day, but they certainly aren't going to be standing up to dedicated firepower. At least their models are actually cool and infinitely less annoying to see than the standard Tzaangor blob. Riding on discs of Tzeentch, they actually feel like a mystical part of the army. I can happily accept the T-Sons have a few of these fellas flying around with them and their weird Tzeentch critters. It's rather harder to stomach the entire blob of Tzaangors because I don't want the 1,000 Tzaangors. Alright, now for the actual 1,000 Sons. Rubric Marines, the sort of kind of dead, dusty ghosts of what was once a proud and noble legion. They're sad, tragic figures that you can happily shove into tank fire and laugh at your opponent when they emerge unscathed. Not quite as strong as they used to be, granted, but the normal toughness 4 Marines get, as well as a 3-up save and 5-up invuln save, they're fairly tanky for their current cost of 105 for 5 models or 190 for 10. They all have rerolls to wound rolls of 1, and if you're in range of an objective you don't control, it's rerolls to all wound rolls. In spite of the relatively slow movement speed of 6 inches, this makes them solid at pushing enemies off of an objective, wherever that may be. While their bolters are largely the standard Marine affair, they are at AP-2, which lets them cut through infantry with far greater ease than you might expect. Scarabocult Terminators are rubrics who were once Terminators, rather obviously. They're largely the standard Terminator affair, being slow as hell and just as tough to match. You can put a strength 10 weapon on one of them to make them all the more threatening, and if they're being led by a Psyker, all wound rolls against them have 1 subtracted. They also just have Deep Strike, because as you might notice if you've played Space Marine 2, having a Terminator squad suddenly riding your ass has got to be in the bottom 10 things that can happen to you in Warhammer 40K. Pink Horrors, if you're running demons, meanwhile, have the dual purpose of some decent ranged firepower, as well as annoying the hell out of your opponent. A 4-up invuln save is good, and their ranged pink flame is, like I said, decent. The main benefit is that every time one dies, you roll a d6, and on a 4-up you get 2 blue horrors. And when those die, you roll again, and on a 4-up you get a brimstone horror. So it just begets more and more nonsense garbage enemies to fight. Yeah, they get worse and worse as they go from pink to blue to brimstone, but as a chaff unit designed to just keep eating bullets, they're great. 115 points for a unit of 10 may sound a bit pricey on the surface for what they give, but if you look at it like 100 115 points for 10 models that just keep coming back as slightly shittier ones to keep harassing the enemy with, suddenly that strikes at least me as a hell of a bargain. Their vehicle selection is fairly robust as well, like I mentioned earlier. Rhino for transport, Chaos Predator for a tank, Hellbrute for a Dreadnought equivalent, Helldrake to throw a metal dragon at people. You have a good amount of options, unlike some of the other Chaos Marine armies, so while an armored Thousand Suns army probably isn't the most optimal way to play, it can be done, and finding something to suit your needs as far as vehicles go is far from impossible. Helldrakes being vehicles, as an aside, has always been funny to me. Yeah, I know they're corrupted fighter jets or whatever, and their pilots are in there if fused with the thing now, but looking at this demon engine dragon and calling it a vehicle just sounds goofy. Fun goofy, mind you, I'm not complaining at all, but still goofy. And saying that, maybe you shouldn't take a Helldrake in the Thousand Suns given the dreadnought that bodied one with a statue in Space Marine 2. I know mechanically on the tabletop that can't happen, but it just seems to be tempting fate, you know? Maybe hold off on taking one if you're up against the Ultramarines. Basically, the whole army having an invuln save means they're all around very tanky, with a decent amount of additional ways that have been mentioned to make them even tankier. Perhaps not quite Death Guard tanky, but you can certainly hold up in a protracted firefight as the Thousand Suns. All this talk is well and good for army choices, but you no doubt want Psychers. It's the Thousand Suns, we're here for Psychers. Well, they provide. Let's look at the Exalted Sorcerers first, both because they're as good a choice as any, and you buy them in a box of 3, so for Psyker spam it is monetarily helpful to grab them. As for their rules, they've got the stat line you'd expect of Space Marines with a nice 4 wounds and 4 up invuln on top of it, and their weapons are decent enough including their psychic ranged attack that has dev wounds. They share that save with the unit they lead, and they can even bring back 1 or 2 bodyguard models around if they'd like, though you may cause yourself D3 wounds if you fail the roll. They're a fairly basic sorcerer, but you have an army where basic sorcerer is a phrase that exists. You can also have the one on the disc of Tzeentch, which is a bit faster, and his abilities are instead to either prevent enemies farther than 18 inches from you from shooting at you, as well as having anyone who did shoot at you move 2 inches slower for both no more moves and charging. If you want someone running an artillery-based guard army to want to kill themselves, throw a bunch of these fellas into your force. A normal sorcerer gives the unit they lead lethal hits, and once a game adds 3 to the attack and strength of psychic weapons. An Infernal Master gives the unit it leads sustained hits to really lay down firepower, and once a turn they can turn a hit, wound, or saving throw into an automatic 6. I'd personally assume it's best to use that on a hit or wound roll, but it can come in clutch if you're trying to tank a single high-power attack. But it's about high time we get some named characters here, and we have 3 if you count the Birdman, who I'll do first. Kairos Fate Weaver is the greater demon of Tzeentch that, just as far as special abilities goes, can get you free command points by passing a leadership test every command phase and forces your opponent to spend an extra CP on a stratagem if they're close to him. His ranged attack is solid with the potential for overcharging it if you don't mind potentially rolling that 1 and blowing one of his own heads off, and his staff can whack things pretty alright in melee. At toughness 10, a 4 up invuln and 20 wounds, he is also a problem that'll take the enemy a good amount of time to get through. He also has 12 inches of movement and fly, which means Birdman is a problem no matter where an enemy is at on the battlefield. Azak Araman is the premier mortal psyker meanwhile, at least for a given meaning of the word mortal. Certainly he's no ordinary man, even ignoring him being a space marine, but compared to the big blue bird and the big red dickhead he stands aside, he's a bit shorter if nothing else. His save is fairly standard, 3 up and with a 4 up invuln, though 6 wounds does make him a bit more long-lasting than his lesser sorceress brethren. 10 inches and fly isn't quite as fast as Kairos, but he gets around, and while his range attacks are solid, he's actually the most damaging in melee with his staff. Much like the rest of the remaining meaty T-Suns, he may be a wizard, but he's still a space marine. If you use him to cast a ritual, he adds 1 to the roll to make him a decent bit more reliable, and after you're done deploying, you can add up to 3 additional units into strategic reserves if you'd like, if you're running him. Not the flashiest of things, which is a shame because he used to be quite a bit more explosive with his power, and nowadays he does seem rather sad compared to his Primarch in the Blue Bird. But at only 100 points, he's also far easier to fit into an army, and if he dies, it's not the biggest deal. 100 points is an acceptable amount to sacrifice if Tzeentch demands it, unlike the main event coming up. Magnus the Red, the Primarch of the Legion and one of the strongest psychers in the galaxy, probably coming in at the number 3 slot to the Emperor and Tzeentch himself in terms of pure psychic might, though others can still give him a run for their money. At toughness 11, a 2 up save and 4 up invuln, he ain't going down easy, especially with a whopping 16 wounds to his name. His gaze is a strength 11 ranged attack that puts the hurt on anyone, and for hordes he has a lesser strength blast attack. As for melee, for some reason known only to the darkest depths of GW's Codex department, he's in some ways better in it than Angron, with less attacks true and potentially less damage, but Magnus hits at a higher strength. Someone probably needs to be taken into account for this, though I suppose you could argue that since Magnus is red, Khorne has a soft spot for him, or mistakes him for Angron sometimes. He can cast 2 rituals from himself per turn instead of just 1 and adds 2 to those rolls, making him by default a focal point of your army even more so than any Primarch already is. And he gets the standard Chaos Primarch aura effects you can swap out at the start of each battle round. He can either subtract 1 from the damage of non-psychic attacks that hit him, give every ranged weapon in an opponent's unit hazardous so they blow themselves up, or add 2 to the movement of nearby Thousand Suns. He's a damn monster, one that you're certainly paying for at 435 points as a time of writing, but one that can certainly earn those points back. For units, the last one I want to bring up specifically is the Mutal of the Vortex Beast, because this thing looks like Tzeentch had diarrhea and crapped it out onto the battlefield. It's not quite the toughest thing, though it's reasonably strong, but most importantly, it has a strength 18 ranged weapon, nearby psychers get a +1 to casting rituals, and anything near it is almost certainly going to be suffering wounds, potentially up to 6 just for the mistake of being close to it. I was almost going to say that the Thousand Suns lacked a bit of super heavy firepower, but not only does this thing have that strength 18 attack that can do up to 12 damage, but it's only 170 points right now. For something that can threaten knights with minimal issues, that ain't bad at all. And for the last few tabletop positives, the models and collecting them. Their new combat patrol honestly ain't bad, with GW managing to remember that people want Chaos Space Marines in their Chaos Space Marine army. You get a nice variety of different stuff, and while I wouldn't repeat buy because one man only needs so many Demon Princes, it's solid for getting yourself both some Zangors, Rubrics, and the Sorcerer with it. They're also a little bit towards the elite end of things as far as armies go, especially if you buy Magnus. He becomes nearly a full quarter of a 2k point army right now, and there's a few ways to build the Thousand Suns without breaking the bank, especially if you go all in on Rubrics, which are 190 points for the full unit of 10. By no means the cheapest, but they could be a hell of a lot worse. Though for Zangor spam, yeah, good luck to ya. The models also just look good. This does have some caveats, but to me the ups outweigh the downs. Magnus and Ahriman both look great, the Zangors are in all honesty fairly nice looking, even if that's probably just because the AOS team designed them, and even the Sekitar robots I think look good. Maybe a bit goofy, but the fun Warhammer goofy. The base Rubrics and arguably even the Terminators don't exactly have the most life in them pose-wise, but honestly this is the army to have that be the case. Their animated suits of armor filled with dust like an even more cursed Alphonse Elric. I don't want them breakdancing across the battlefield, they should look stiff and unwieldy. Your mileage may vary, and I'm sure you can manage to pose them more dynamically if you really want, but I think they're fine. With the good done, we must now discuss the bad, however. And first off, you are a Tzeentch army. This overarching downside comes with quite the variety of sub-downsides, so while most of the things I'll mention stem from this, keep in mind it can be a pretty big thing in the way of collecting them. First off, you are the army most prone to backstabbing out of all the Chaos Space Marines. It is nothing but ploys upon ploys for these bastards, one giant conga line of backstabs that stretches across the entirety of the Legion. Magnus left the Spire Guard to die on Fenris, Ahriman went behind Magnus's back to cast his Rubric, and the countless different sorcerers below them just love trying to pull the wool over the eyes of their fellows. And of course all of this is before we take into account Tzeentch himself. Tzeentch immediately saved Ahriman from being killed by Magnus after the Rubric was cast, which was then followed by 10,000 years of Ahriman being used like a fleshlight by Tzeentch for laughs. Camaraderie doesn't really exist in this Legion, not as a whole anyways. Nurgle's one happy family, Cornelis doesn't really count as backstabbing because they're all quite aware their fellows will swing an axe at their head at a moment's notice and they love that, and at least a Slaaneshi Marine will wait until you bore them to kill you. With anything Tzeentch, a backstab can just happen, and oftentimes for no good reason other than Tzeentch likes backstab, so if you don't want an army modeled off of Starscream, then this is perhaps the last place you should look. Tzeentch plots are also oftentimes the most predictable thing on the planet, and the way you can see them fail is kinda boring. I know Space Marine 2 wasn't really going for the most outlandish and wacky Tzeentch plot imaginable, and it was only made more obvious by the fact that Thousand Suns were in the marketing. But when the one tech priest was going on about how his project would perfectly repel the Immaterium only for it to turn into wacky Tzeentch nonsense, was anyone surprised in the slightest? Oh wow, this whole thing was orchestrated by Tzeentch. Who could have seen this coming, except anyone who's read more than a single page of lore about Tzeentch? And then that's usually followed up during the defeat of the Tzeentchian follower, and indeed a given Thousand Sun, with some kind of, how did this go wrong? I can't believe Tzeentch betrayed me. Almost every Tzeentch follower thinks they're the special guy who's gonna somehow come away from their deal with the devil on top of things, and they never do. You could say this is a chaos problem as a whole, but Tzeentch naturally magnifies it. They've less agency than any other chaos worshipper, and while it can be fun to rebel against fate and free yourself from your master's chains, the Thousand Suns are essentially never going to be able to pull it off. They keep making deals with Tzeentch because they think they're all that guy, and while arrogance can be fun, it can also be really grating. The Thousand Sons have a bit of a punching bag problem in general for that matter though, which seems to go beyond Tzeentch screwing with his followers like always. In the Horus Heresy, they were of course blown away by the Space Wolves, and no matter what version of the event you read, it's a pretty decisive Space Wolf victory. You don't call something the burning of Prospero if it's a two-sided affair. They then immediately get turned into dust, except for like 10% of them being generous. The Space Wolves tend to beat them up, including Magnus himself whenever they fight. Of course, Space Marine 2 is the entire game of Titus manhandling them for several hours straight. And to top it off, Ahriman was made to look like a fool in front of the Ynnari. The specifics of this weren't too bad, truth be told. He was doing quite well and was only driven off at the last moment because Yvraine reversed the rubric on a few of the Marines before throwing them into the warp, taunting Ahriman as he went to save his newly restored to life comrades. All in all, it wasn't bad, but in this case, the specifics don't matter. Ahriman was made to look stupid by the Ynnari. That's bad. You don't come away from that kind of event looking good, because even if you single-handedly destroyed the Ynnari, who cares? It's the goddamn Ynnari. They're also not the most numerically powerful faction. Even during the Great Crusade, they were always one of the smallest legions, and come the Rubric, that got worse. They do recruit more Marines through either traitors or making them, and they can to some extent make new Rubric Marines, or even replace fallen ones if they can get together enough of the souls and dust of the ones that were destroyed. But there's never going to be a tide of thousand suns sweeping over the land, and every sorcerer you lose in your tabletop match is lore-wise a pretty hefty loss. There's only so many of them to lose, so unless you want to flavor your army as increasingly being held together by chaos undivided sorcerers to replace losses, you'd best be careful with your fleshy sons. As a traitor legion, you're also lower in the hierarchy than the loyalist legions, relating much to the previous point. Magnus the Red got clowned on by everyone, from the Space Wolves to Guilliman and the Footsteps of Terra, and you're gonna be reduced to the cackling villain more often than not, whose schemes are thwarted. This is admittedly a problem inherent with all chaos and traitor legions in particular, since if they win a sufficiently climactic enough battle, then there's no more Warhammer 40K, and that'd be no good either for us or GW's margins, but just worth keeping in mind. As with many traitor legions, their fall, not speaking charitably, is stupid as hell. I've come around somewhat on the Emperor not telling Magnus what exactly he was doing. Assuming Magnus's fate was to ultimately be a webway battery on the Golden Throne, that's not exactly the retirement you tell someone they're getting if you want them to stick around. But beyond that, and this is opinion, yes, so much of it has become irredeemably stupid with the Horus Heresy series. When it was just a passage in a codex, it wasn't exactly a long tale, but it was understandable. Magnus and his ilk were dabbling with things the Emperor felt they shouldn't, so they were ordered to be erased. Simple, to the point, solid. Nowadays, we have Magnus breaking the Webway project as the start. Big E, while telling him the full extent could have been quite bad to say the least, could have at least told the single most powerful psychic Primarch that, hey, there's warp stuff going on here, please be very careful. But he didn't do that. There surely could have been some lie or half-truth he told Magnus to make him more careful. Hell, he could have very well just said, hey Magnus, this is a warp tunnel in an extra-dimensional realm I'm working on, please don't smash through the walls like the Kool-Aid Man. He could have just left out the part where Magnus ends up hooked up to it like a generator. But he didn't do that, and Magnus did crash through like the Kool-Aid Man. So naturally the Emperor gets pissed and Leman Russ goes to capture Magnus. Horus then tells Leman to kill Magnus instead because Horus just wants him off the board. Or at least, Horus informs Leman of all the sorcery Magnus has been doing and lets Leman jump to his natural conclusion of just killing him. This is admittedly slightly better than Leman just going, well okay Horus, but you would assume the Emperor's executioner knows what his boss wants and be willing to stick to it. Leman Russ's own reason for killing Magnus, as he told Valdor himself, was a step above the soldier from TF2 screaming, if God wanted you to live, he would not have created me. Leman gets second thoughts though and tries to phone call Magnus, which Magnus keeps ignoring. When the Thousand Sons ask Magnus, hey dad, what the hell's going on, he calmly tells them that all of Prospero is now going to die because he feels they need to atone for their sins. Whatever you feel for yourself is fine enough, man, but I really don't think you get to make that decision for everyone else on the planet. And then we get to the inevitable end where Leman breaks Magnus's back, Magnus realizes he's been played like a fiddle, and calls upon Tzeentch and damns himself because his morality and loyalties are a revolving door. Combine that with whatever was happening on the Siege of Terra, and Magnus potentially being able to be redeemed, but also Vulcan said that was a delusion Magnus basically cooked up in his arrogance and fear, and we have the Wizards of the Traitor Legion becoming what they are because Daddy Dearest is a colossal fool. This isn't necessarily bad, I'll admit. It's nowhere near as bad as the World Leaders in my opinion, because the Thousand Sons at least pretended to listen to orders in regards to magic, where Angron and his legion were rabid dogs that should have been put down. and as Dungeons & Dragons has it, intelligence and wisdom are 2 different stats. But we have this legion supposedly versed in the mystic arts and aware of the true nature of reality, and they're all so foolish and egotistical that to hell with missing the forest for the trees, they were missing the forest fire for the leaves. Countless incidents of them snubbing others and refusing to admit others might have a point led to them having their souls sold to the forces of hell, because their father was a moron, and that stupidity more than the flesh change was apparently the worst curse their gene seed had. There's something to be said for tragic arrogance, but there's arrogance, and then there's thinking you're such hot shit that you're immune to the consequences of sticking a fork in an electrical socket. And the final bit on Prospero. There were potential factors at play, yes, warp interference in no small part from Magnus himself, Magnus being basically catatonic as he realized how bad he messed up, but you can boil down the entire burning of Prospero and all that followed to ultimately having happened because Magnus wouldn't pick up the phone when Lehman Russ was calling for one final attempt at talking things out. The nail in the coffin was hammered in because Magnus is not available right now. Please leave a message at the sound of Kairos Fateweaver laughing at him. And the entire legion became the evil sorcerers of the forces of hell because Magnus did nothing wrong. And last lore downside to get away from that rant, as a Tzeentch army, you can never win. Like ever. Or rather, you can win tactical victories, but a strategic one is forever out of your grasp. The Thousand Sons serve Tzeentch, which means even if they truly were on the cusp of ultimate victory one day, then Tzeentch would self-sabotage because he'd have nothing to plot towards, nothing to scheme against but himself. That would probably keep him busy for eons, but anything short of forever isn't enough time for the Chaos Gods. So more so than the others, you're destined for eternal failure. First and foremost, as the Psyker army, you're one of the most obvious armies when it comes to your enemy picking their targets. Precision weapons are the bane of you, because your enemy knows what's important and what's ultimately just Psyker support. Since you're the only army that really has anything resembling the Psychic phase nowadays, it means that countering at least your army rule is easy as sin. Get some snipers and take potshots at the sorcerers. Your Psykers are largely all tough enough to handle some firepower, and there's various ways in the detachments to mitigate this, but if they get killed, or at least the ones in the front line get killed, you can easily lose out on being able to use your army's main gimmick in the rituals. So be careful with that, and remember the rubrics exist to serve the sorcerers, even if that means their death. With how many psychic weapons they have, and ways to make the non-psychic weapons psychic, you also have the funniest problem in the game now, which is you are perhaps the only remaining army that can be brutally harmed by going against something like the Sisters of Silence. A single anti-psychic unit can render some of your most powerful units not quite worthless, but definitely not up to par. This won't come up terribly often, but it can, so if nothing else, be careful against a known Custodes player. A good chunk of their army is dedicated to making you specifically cry. You also have an army rule that can hurt you while at the same time giving you no benefit. The powers, to my understanding, go off even if you roll a double or triple as long as you meet the criteria, but that also means you're at risk of playing your army correctly and still eating mortal wounds because you rolled 2 1s for a ritual. No spells for you in that instance, just pain. This is very Tzeentchian, and I'd still be overcasting those spells because why not, but just keep it in mind. Most Thousand Sons lists are also going to look fairly similar. Everyone knows that for chaff you're bringing the bird goats, you're going to have a lot of sorcerers of some flavor. Their fairly extensive list of non-Thousand Sons through the vehicles does give them some variety, but beyond that, people are going to know what you're bringing to the table. Not helping this is the fact that ever since they were properly released, I'm fairly certain their only truly new model was the Sekitar robots. Which I like, but I know a lot of T-Sons fans were disappointed, and this isn't my main army by any means, so I don't think my opinion counts here. Not that it ever does, but it really doesn't count here. Point is, most people have a solid grasp of at least the basic concept of what your army does. While you do have a fairly robust amount of higher strength attacks, most of them are also incredibly obvious on a related note. Dealing with infantry is such an easy thing for you between rubrics getting -2 AP on their bolters and all the psychic attacks that's basically a non-issue for you. You can chew through chaff like nobody's business, and there's not much that can be done to stop that. But the moment you put down a Defiler or a Predator tank, people can very safely assume how you'll be using it. They have enough options that they aren't limited, but not so many that if you use one, everyone's not going to know what's going to be happening with it. Even the Mutilith Vortex Beast, which has great potential against hordes, isn't immune to this, because if you bring one against someone with a lot of armor or knights, they know exactly how you're using it. That bad boy only has 1 strength 18 attack, mind you, and he hits on 3s, so while wounding with it isn't a problem, hitting may be an issue. That's what command point rerolls are for, though, I guess. This applies to Magnus too, but as a Primarch those will always be firing magnets, so it's less worth mentioning. mentioning with him. Even saying that, you might be able to trick someone into getting into melee range with him. He's the nerd Primarch you tell your opponent before he rips Guilliman in half with 7 strength 16 attacks. This next con isn't too much of an outright negative, strictly speaking, but as the only remaining truly psychic army with powers that haven't just been reduced to shooting attacks, you can really see how far Psyker stuff has fallen with his army. Airman used to be the king of spamming out Doombolt. Fighting against an Airman player wasn't a battle of the minds, it was like playing Ikaruga. Now all he gets to do is add 1 to ritual rolls, and he can't throw out a million Doombolts anymore. It's just kinda sad to see, and it hurts more here than even arguably the Eldar, because they still have a taste of the fun we could be having. Everyone else had to go cold turkey. GW is still letting you get a little hit every now and again just to tease you. Though admittedly for an overview like these videos are, I don't have too many more weaknesses to add as far as rules go. I even made sure to check some meta sites, and yeah, the Thousand Suns are in a fairly decent spot overall. Not the highest, but certainly not the lowest. Their final tabletop downside must be mentioned though, especially since with their new combat patrol I can't milk the Zangor jokes nearly as easily. This army is firmly in painting hell. You'll be doing so much trim and so much detail for even the basic Rubric Marines. Once you start touching sorcerers, good luck to you, man. Painting this army is gonna take ages, and assembling it is gonna poke your fingers in all sorts of fun ways from those spiky bits they all got. While this isn't a criticism I normally make, honest to God, only get either a single character model or a single box of rubrics when you start getting interested in them. The painting vibe check will be inevitable upon starting that process. Ironically enough, you'll get so much practice that you'll probably end up way better off at doing trim and detail work with the Thousand Suns than if you picked another army. But saying you'll be better at painting because the army can be such a pain in the ass to paint doesn't really feel like a positive. Thousand Suns tend to be good painters, and the Spartans were some of the best warriors around, because they killed everyone who wasn't a great warrior. It's like the tabletop gaming version of that. And that was the Thousand Suns, the only army who got to keep being magical in 40K, the vile sons of Magnus, and everyone's favorite wizard punching bags. They're destined for failure, but who doesn't love themselves a nice tragedy every now and again, yeah? Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the bad decisions to my Thousand Suns, keeping me going to become what I am nowadays, even though I should probably be doing something else. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching, and take care out there. I remember what you did to my Swarmlord commander, you Soul Ring on turn 1 playing dickhead. Magnus the Red, more like Magnus the stupid dumb idiot. Call me Lehman Russ with these sick burns, am I right, fellas? I'm a real comedic genius, educated in the realm of clownery. I'm hilarious. I am so lonely.